Welcome to the Executive Outlook. Today's guest has one of the most unique journey we had on the show. She started her career as a nuclear physics researcher, completed her PhD, and then she made a bold move into the world of data and eventually becoming a data strategy leader in the fast moving gaming industry. Rebecca is currently head of data at OBB, a French gaming company. With over 11 years of experience spanning research, mobile gaming, and data strategy, she brings a perspective that is both deeply analytical and very practical grounded. Today, we are going to talk about something every data leader wrestles with and how to build a data strategy that actually serves the business, not just the data teams. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Isha. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. So you started your career and then ended up leading the data strategy in the gaming industry. So how did this journey happen and what made you fall in love with data?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. And it's also like one of the questions I get asked a lot. Yes, so I'll talk about my journey. I first came to France because of my passion for physics and maths. And that led me to do my PhD in nuclear physics, where I was studying the effect of radiation on different kinds of materials. But it's also during that time that I realized that I really enjoy analyzing data, finding patterns, and making conclusions based on the analysis that I have done. And I remember that there are not many experiments that could validate what we were theoretically studying at that time. There was one experiment in Japan that was validating some of the things that we had theoretically simulated on our side. And that was like very exciting for me that I could see that we were on the right track. Without experiments, we were able to simulate what had happened in materials at a nanoscale level. So I thought that if this feeling I can have on a regular basis, on a day-to-day basis, that would be really interesting for me. And that is when I thought about, okay, what about looking into industry? And here, as you already know as well, that with data you can have an impact that you can see on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And that really made me fall in love with like this whole career path of working with data.
Amazing. You have also worked as a part of early data teams and led the
Yes.
data teams for startup at different stages. So, what was it like building data infrastructure from scratch, and how did you manage the business expectation while turning them into the reality?
Yes, that is a very interesting question. And I'm sure, like anyone who is joining a startup or leading a startup will definitely have this question in their mind at some point. So, from my perspective, I feel like it's almost like you want to reach somewhere and you're building a staircase, but at the same time, as the staircase is being built, you're also climbing it. Which is which is a risky business, but it is that you know where you want to go and you are working towards it, and it will take time, but it is something that needs to be done from a data perspective. And I feel that in my experience it has been both challenging and satisfying at the same time, because the challenge is that in a startup, like when we want to do things like really fast, sometimes it can be tricky to talk about, okay, this is where we want to be in 1 year. So that is not something that is part of a startup DNA, but that has to be inculcated, because at some point it can be blocking for the startup if they don't think about this in advance. So on one hand, you have, the challenge of convincing the business leaders, the decision makers in the startup, that this is something that will bring returns in the long term. On the other hand, you also have to kind of be very pragmatic about it and be open with the business on like what the value it is bringing. So you need to have this open communication with the business stakeholders that, okay, you won't see, the benefits of this probably in the short term or while it is being built, but you will see the advantages in the long run. And this also sometimes boils down to doing like a cost analysis of that. This is what we are putting in terms of like manpower and the softwares that we might have to buy for specific things or subscribe to, and then showing what is the impact in terms of like business, whether you're able to access data more quickly, you're able to have cleaner data, you're able to give that self-service facility to all the business stakeholders without having a data analyst gatekeeper. So these are things that you need to balance, especially in a startup, because you have to keep showing both the value in the short term, but also the value in the long term, and build towards that. So overall, I would say communication is key, and it is important to communicate when things are going well, when things are going according to plan, but it becomes more important to communicate when things are not going well, because then sometimes you make some assumptions that okay, this is what is going to happen. Sometimes there are more challenges that you could foresee, and in those situations it's important to make sure that the business stakeholders are still looped in and they are not left guessing. So that way, it is something that shouldn't be, in my opinion, solely the topic that data team talks about. It should be a topic that the whole company is aware about, especially the business stakeholders, because they are the ones who would be taking decisions based on the data infrastructure we build and everything we put in place as a data team.
Amazing. Like from the very early on, right? You mentioned that okay, you have involved in building the strategy for the company, specifically in the gaming industry. So after creating that strategy, what was the business outcome the business have impacted because of the data analysis and strategy that you have created? You can share any like positive outcomes that the business.
Like in one of my experiences, there was one issue that we had like a lot of dashboards built, but users, the business stakeholders, were not really looking at them or not taking decisions based on these, and they were mostly driven by gut feeling. So sometimes that can happen. So what we did in that case was that I spoke to the business stakeholders, tried to understand what are their apprehensions, what is stopping them from using these dashboards. And that's when I realized that some of these dashboards had become outdated compared to what they were working on. And some of these dashboards did not probably speak the same language as them, which meant, like, for example, like in one of the dashboards, we had gross revenue while the finance wanted net revenue. So it wasn't matching. So then they completely abandoned it. So what we did in order to make sure that, we close this gap was for each of the business units like finance, product, marketing, we had like specific workshops talking to each of them about like what are the decisions they take on a daily, weekly basis, what are the main KPIs they are looking at, and we made sure that the dashboards align exactly with that. So, it was about two things. It was firstly about data literacy, making sure that, like we are also on board and they understand the metrics that we are showing. And secondly, it was aligning with their objectives. So it was about aligning with their team objectives. And that way we were able to like close the gap between what they were looking for and what we provided. And very quantifiable example, like outcome of that was that when we completed this dashboard migration, we could see 4 times more people using our dashboards compared to before. And this also translated into more data driven discussions. So we saw that in each of their meetings, they would open up a dashboard and talk about it. And even when they share some decisions with like the C level, they would share parts of the dashboard. And that was like a very, I think a sign of success for us, because if people are able to use the dashboards for decisions without having us involved and without hesitating on like whether they are taking the right conclusions. That is like a win for the data team.
Thank you so much for sharing that interesting use case. So, once you have the strategy in place, how do
Yeah.
you translate that strategy for the data engineers, analysts, or different teams so that they can actually work on it without losing the sight of a bigger picture? Because one of the
Yeah.
problems that they don't understand the business language, they understand the technical language. So, how
Yeah.
you bridge that gap?
Yes, that is interesting question. So it's something that definitely we need to be mindful of every time we have like a strategy or a roadmap. So what has worked in my case is that every time I have like a strategy, I also involve the data team so that they are aligned with, you know, what we are working towards for the company. The way I try my best to allot the projects is to align it with what each individual wants to grow on their side. For example, we had a data analyst who wanted to grow her data engineering skills. So I gave her a project that was more data engineering centric. And that way, you know, like she was really motivated to do well in that. And similarly, we have had like someone, a data analyst doing a machine learning project or a machine learning engineer doing like a data engineering or analyst project. So we kind of, it's not always possible, but I try as much as I can to also align that. And then I sit with them and define like a set of deliverables. So the first draft is always coming from them, and it's always what they think should be the outcome of this. And it's very as specific as we can get it. For example, if it's a dashboard, it would be that, okay, these would be the filters, these would be overall the charts, and that's how they see it. And then I would have a discussion with them to see if they think this is the best, if this can be improved, and so on. And then we agree on like what exactly this task means, this project means. And because the roadmap already has like some timeline associated, so we take this task and put it in the sprint that that it would fall on. And we typically work like for now we are working in sprints of 2 weeks, so we put the task in there. And we try to set aside at least 20% of the weekly time, that is 1 day a week, for long term projects. So that way they have like one dedicated day that they work on that. Again, because it's a startup and because we call them like phantom tasks, some phantom tasks arrive that we did not anticipate earlier. So sometimes 20% goes down to 10% or 5%. But there are also weeks where we can extend this 20% to 40%. Like, for example, there are iterations going on the game development side. So we have some time, on our side and so on. So we adjust that accordingly. And that way we make sure that every week we make some progress towards the long term vision, even if it's sometimes 5%, sometimes 20%, sometimes 40%. But we try to make sure that there is some progress. And almost monthly I try to set aside like one of the one-to-ones where we discuss more in depth about like how the progress on the long term projects is going, to see if they need any kind of support to progress, if they are blocked by anything, and so on. So this way we kind of try to make sure we progress. But it's true that because we are in a startup, there can be some shorter term projects that can take precedence or more priority over the long term from time to time. During the stand-ups, we discuss this and make sure that no one is blocked on the data side. So that is like the first thing. And second thing is that we ensure, even if it's like minimal progress, we do make some progress. And those small steps go a long way in contributing to the overall big picture that we have in mind.
So, another question I have is, you mentioned that a lot of machine learning algorithms you use in the gaming side of it. Do you want to share some use cases and how machine learning has actually helped the gaming industry?
I think there are many aspects in which machine learning can be used on gaming. One use case that always is there is regarding user customization, like the whole personalizing whatever you go through in a game based on your level in the game. And this can be in the form of matchmaking. For example, if it's a multiplayer game, the matchmaking, there's always a matchmaking algorithm that makes sure you are like playing with players who have a very different level than yours, because then you can at some point be disappointed, or you might find it too easy or too difficult. So we want to be in that sweet spot of like not too difficult but still challenging kind of. And so that is like one of the use cases. Another use case can be regarding, so it depends on the game. Like some games are heavily monetized with ads, some can be monetized with in-app purchases. So if it's regarding in-app purchases, the offers that you see can be personalized to you. So for example, if you have the habit of spending some amount every day, and we see that you are not exceeding a certain amount, maybe we'll give you benefits to, like we'll show special offers to you with discounts or with a lot more benefits in game, so that you are tempted to buy that. So that is one. So if the game is focusing on ads, then it can be regarding ad frequency. So if we see that someone is used to watching a lot of ads, but they are not churning, they are not leaving because of like the ad frequency, then we can have like a higher ad frequency on this user so that it can be better monetized. On the other hand, if we see some churn indicators, then probably we would decrease the ad frequency for that user to make sure they stay in the game long enough. Again, all of these are optimizations that are done depending on what the kind of game is, whether we are optimizing for retention, monetization, and so on. So yeah, so these are some of the use cases that are like.
So one of the challenge in the gaming industry is millions of users, huge data. So how do you make sure that the quality stays on the top of it? And how do you handle such massive data?
Yeah, that is true. That in gaming we do have big data, so it comes with its own challenges. Like whenever I think about such problems, I like to go back to first principles and think about like what are the steps at which the quality can be lost. So typically, whenever we have any kind of transformations, so we do our transformations using DBT modeling, and over here we make sure that at each step of transformation we have data quality checks, and we make sure there is no loss of data, and that step is repeated at whenever we have any sort of transformations involved for data. And then besides that, we also have what we call monitoring dashboards. And what we do over here is we have a comparison of how the KPIs compare with the source of truth for each of the KPIs, and that we make sure that if it exceeds a threshold, we are notified automatically. We have Slack channels set up for that. But yeah, one thing that's important is that sometimes some data sources will have some level of discrepancy. So it's also important to know what is the threshold, because otherwise we'll be getting hundreds of alerts every day, and it will just be like firefighting mode. So for what really helps in this case is to have like thresholds, acceptable thresholds for each of the data sources as well. And for example, like I can take the example of like the revenue that we get from users that typically has at least about like 5% of discrepancy. And that usually comes from like the currency exchange rates. So there are, we can have like daily exchange rates, but the exchange rate at that particular time when when the purchase was made was probably different, so there can be a bit of discrepancy, and we cannot have like 100% matching data all the time. So this data, we accept that okay, there is 5% of discrepancy, and we monitor that. In case it's more than that, we get an alert and then we look into what caused it. Maybe there are some patterns. For example, once we saw that it was linked to one specific country and the exchange rate related to that had fluctuated too much, which led to a bigger discrepancy on that day. So we adjusted the threshold. We monitored what exactly was the reason for that, and we put a check on that. Similarly, for the other sources that we have, like for the game data, usually we have like almost 99%, like it's a good match, like there is not much data quality loss in the other sources, but that is still something that we monitor. We also monitor on a day-to-day basis for big changes in any of the KPIs. For example, if we know that the organic installs on a game that we get is around 50,000 each day, and then it has gone down to 5,000 on a specific day, there is something going wrong. So we also monitor any big changes on the major KPIs, and that way we make sure that the data quality stays reliable and there is no issue.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. Uh, Another question I have is, and this is the last one, all right? So, you must have had a project that really tested you. So, what has been the toughest situations you faced, and what did you take away from?
That is a very interesting question. So, a lot of projects come to my mind, but I think the toughest would be it was an A/B test that we were running on a game, and it was a fairly new team as well, and I was new to the company as well. So, we weren't used to, like, we didn't know anything about the working styles. So, what happened in this A/B test was that there were two versions of the game, and the results of that was like, say, group A was clearly winning as opposed to like the control version, but this result was very counterintuitive for the team, and so they did not want to take a decision just because the dashboard said that it is a winning. So what we did with this specific A/B test is that we tried to understand why the player behavior is such that version A is winning. We did a whole lot of analysis to explain why this is happening, and that what the dashboards are showing is consistent with what is happening. It's not an error, or it's not outlier behavior that is driving this kind of performance. And once we did that, we saw that the team was still hesitant, like it was divided among itself. Like there was someone in the team who was convinced, who wanted to go with what data was saying, and there was someone else in the team who wasn't very convinced, and they still wanted to go in the opposite direction. So we were having all these discussions. So what I told my team was that, okay, let's break this down into revenue, let's break this down into retention, because these are the two metrics that matter a lot for a game to do well. And we did like a whole analysis on what can be the loss of revenue with this version, and what
Mhm.
can be the gain of retention, and so on. And with this analysis, we were able to convince everyone on the team that they should go with what the data was saying, and otherwise it is like a lot of risk of loss that they would bring upon themselves. So that way we were able to reach a conclusion, and that was a decision that was data driven in the end. What I take away from this is that communication is key, and it
Mhm.
is very important to talk the same language as the business stakeholders. Like in
Mhm.
this case, the person who was not earlier convinced was had a strong finance background. So when we spoke of the decision in terms of like revenue, potential risk, potential loss, it was more convincing, and that was something that was more real for the person. So it's very important to know your audience, know how to communicate and how to talk in terms of what is relevant to them, what is driving them, and then approach the analysis from their perspective and see where you can add value. And I think this is one of qualities that is quite underrated in data, because at the end of the day, whatever you're doing with data is to support the business, it's to help the business do well. If you can communicate that and communicate with different audiences in their language, it is, I think, the best you can do for your team and also building credibility within the company.
Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank
This is really good. I agree that communication, the way language they speak, if we talk in that language, everything gets solved easily.
Yeah.
So that is very important. All right. So that's it. That is all I wanted to ask. Again, I want to thank you for sharing your journey, your experiences, and the way you think about data, stakeholder trust, building things that actually help the businesses. The insights were really, really good. Conversation was very interesting. A lot of data stories I hear, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure having you on the executive.
Thank you, Isha. It was really great experience for me also to sometimes sit back and see what is happening and to explain things in these terms. And thank you so much for this opportunity and for the interesting questions. Yeah, looking forward to seeing more of videos from you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.